Hey everyone, I'm really excited to be bringing you the first part of the color blocking series that I'm putting together. In this first video, we will be covering general principles of color blocking, techniques that you can use, and then in the second part, I will be demonstrating color blocking specifically on the Logi pouch. So in the first part, I'm using the Pythagorean pouch and the Betty pouch as examples, and I will go through all the different ways you can add color blocking to your pattern. But it is not specific to those patterns. You can use these techniques on any patterns that you're sewing up. And I'm really excited to see what everyone comes up with. So let's get going. Color blocking can be done for lots of different reasons. You can do it if you want to switch up the look of a pattern that you've used a few times. If it's got a solid panel on the front and you just want to break up a print that you're using. You can use it if you have a small piece of fabric or a panel that is not quite big enough for the pattern that you are using. You can use color blocking so that you can still use that pattern. You can use it if you accidentally cut your fabric incorrectly and then you don't have enough to continue with the pattern. You can color block and then you can continue on with the bag as you had planned. I really like to use color blocking when I have small scraps of fabric left, particularly fabric that I really like and I don't want to get rid of it, but I don't have enough to do any of my usual projects with it. Color blocking is a really great option for those situations. So I'm going to show you a few different ways to get the most out of your fabric when you're color blocking so that you can come up with some really unique, creative ways to personalize your bags and mix up the patterns that you've been using over and over again. For this tutorial, you will need your scraps of fabric that you want to color block with, and you will need your chosen pattern that you are going to be putting the color blocked panel on. I have various different scraps of cotton woven and vinyl here that I'm going to be using to show you some different ways that you can make the most out of pieces of fabric that you might otherwise find to be not quite useful in your bag making. There are a few different ways that you can do your color blocking. There are really two techniques that I use and one that is a hybrid of those two. Basically, you can join your fabric together and then cut out your pattern. You can cut out your individual color blocked pieces and then sew them together using a modified pattern piece with a seam allowance added on, or you can do a hybrid of those two. So that would be when you would cut out part of the pattern piece and then add on another piece of fabric to complete the pattern piece and then cut it to size. So that works particularly well if you have a small scrap of fabric that you really want to use for a certain pattern piece and you want to have certain pattern placement with that piece of fabric. So you can cut that first using the pattern piece to get that in the right spot and the right size, and then add on the other pieces of material to make the full pattern piece that you're going to work with. First of all, I'm going to demonstrate what I think is the easiest way to do your color blocking and the way that is the least likely to end up with a pattern piece that is too small for your project. So I have this material here that I use for a different project and just had this amount left that is a decent sized scrap, but it is not quite big enough for an entire bag. I'm going to be using the Pythagorean pouch pattern, and this part here is big enough to fit the entire pattern piece, but I can only do one side. So what I'm going to do is some color blocking so that I can get both sides of the pouch for this pattern. So this piece here, I know is good to go, so I'm not going to work with that part, but I am going to go up to this scrap that I'm going to color block so I can cut out another pattern piece. So I'm just going to separate that from the bulk just to get that out of the way, and I'm going to cut this from this material, but not quite at the moment. First, I'm going to work with the color blocked part. So I have my scrap that I want to use for my color blocking. I'm going to take my pattern piece so I can get an idea of how much extra fabric I need to add to this with another print or a solid so that I'll have enough to make the full pattern piece. So looking at it here, it's not quite tall enough on this side because it cuts off here, but if I go to the other side, I can fit that on, and I can see here that I need about another 6 inches added on to the edge here to be able to have enough for this entire pattern piece, allowing for the joining seam. You want to make sure that you have at least a 1/2 inch overlap between your two pieces, preferably 3/4 of an inch, and that will allow you to do a 3/8 of an inch seam between your two scraps of fabric so that you have enough width or height for your color blocked pattern piece. So I have a scrap of solid vinyl here, and I'm just going to see if this piece is going to be big enough for what I want. I want it to overlap 3/4 of an inch. So it's overlapping with the first scrap 3/4 of an inch, which means that a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance join would come right down here. And then I can see if this scrap is big enough. So place my pattern piece on, and yep, that looks good. So what I then want to do is have a straight edge to sew those two pieces together. If you wanted to, you could do an angled piece. If your scrap was a different shape, you could cut this on an angle. For this demonstration, I'm just going to do a straight line. I want to make sure that we're good. Double checking I've got enough space for my seam allowance, which I do. And then I want this edge here and this edge here to be straight so that I can join together my two scraps. So I'm going to grab my ruler and rotary cutter, and I'm just going to cut a straight edge from the first piece, and that will be the side that we line up. And then I need a straight edge for this piece, which it's already pretty straight, but just straighten that up a little bit more. And then I'm going to check it again, overlapping the two 3/4 of an inch. I need to press this to keep it a little flatter. And then before I cut anything else, I want to make sure that it's still good. Okay, so that is right, and that is going to be a big enough piece. So what I'm also going to do to stop me getting confused about the placement of this oddly shaped scrap is just cut off this piece that is obviously an excess piece there. So now we're working with these two scraps here. Before I sew these together, I want to make sure that the two pieces are interfaced appropriately for the type of material that they are. So this is cotton woven, so I'm going to put a woven interfacing on that. This is vinyl, so I'm not going to interface that. And then we will be ready to sew together these two scrap pieces. I have the interfacing on this scrap now, and I'm going to join together the straight edges that we cut. I'm going to clip them together, and then I'm going to sew the two scraps with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And when I have sewn that seam, I will fold open the join and top stitch on either side. When I am overlapping two scrap pieces that haven't specifically been cut to size for the pattern, I like to use a minimum of 1/4 of an inch for my seam allowance, but preferably 3/8 of an inch if you have enough of the material to do that. And I will just sew straight along using the edge of my presser foot lined up with the edge of the fabric. Then I'm going to fold open that seam, and I'm going to increase my stitch length for top stitching. When you fold open the seam, you can choose to top stitch on just one side or on both sides. Because of this join here, I'm going to top stitch on both sides of the join and fold open that seam, which will reduce the bulk in the top zipper and also reduce the bulk in the bottom seam. And then sewing down here at 1/8 of an inch all the way to the end. Then I will turn and come back up the other side. And sewing back down this way. And you can see that this edge here is lined up with the join here. So I get a nice, straight, consistent top stitch line. With that sewn together and top stitched, we can now cut out our pattern piece. Take your exterior piece and position it on that joined fabric where you would like to cut it. If when you go to place your pattern piece on, you find that the piece is still too short for what you want, you can add another color block in another part. But if you're happy with it, and where that joint is going to be, then you can go ahead and cut out your pattern piece. And then you can cut out your other side or remaining pattern pieces per the pattern, with or without color blocking, depending on how it is you want to complete your bag. And then you have your 2 pattern pieces, and you would just sew that together as normal. I just wanted to add in here that where your color block joins, it's really a good idea to just reinforce where that join is, especially if you've cut through the top stitching or you haven't back stitched it, because you don't want that to come undone in your finished bag, especially when you are constructing the rest of the bag or birthing it. I just recommend putting a couple of back and forth stitches across the join there within the seam allowance, just to really reinforce that there. The next method that I want to show you is when you take your pattern piece and you are going to break it up into different sections and then cut out the individual pattern pieces. So I'm going to flip over my pattern and I'm just going to draw the lines that I want to use for my color blocking. When you are drawing in your lines, the things that you want to consider are where your pattern joins are going to be. So you do not want to be drawing a line where you are going to have an extra seam in an area that is already bulky. So that's going to be places like where your corners are, where your zippers are. So you want to have it in the middle of a straight part of your pattern piece. So a join here and a join here is not going to affect the construction of the bag. And I'm going to put another one just along here to divide this solid pattern piece up into 3 different sections. And then I'm going to cut on these lines. If you are using a lot of different segments when you're doing this, then it may be useful to put directions on here. So for example, this one goes up. And the same way as you piece together pattern pieces when you print off the PDF patterns, you can put some kind of mark here to show that that is where the joins go, so that you know when you cut out your pattern pieces where everything is going to go. So we're going to cut out each of these individual pieces, making sure that when we do, we are adding seam allowance to the sides that we have cut. We don't need to add a seam allowance to the outside because that's already included in the pattern, but you do want to add it to these areas that you have cut. If you wish, you can transfer this onto another sheet of paper and then draw in the seam allowance, or you can just add it in with your ruler when you're cutting, which is how I'm going to do it. Take your first scrap of fabric and your cut pattern piece and flip it over and work from the back. And what we're going to do is we're going to place our pattern piece down and we're going to just draw in those seam allowances so that we know we have them when we are sewing together all of our pieces. So just drawing that line in right at the edge. And then when we cut, we're cutting 3/8 of an inch away from that line. And then we turn it. I'm going to draw in the line at the edge of the pattern piece, which is the line we will be sewing on. And then we're going to cut 3/8 of an inch away from that line. And then we're just going to cut around the rest of the existing lines of the pattern piece that we didn't draw in and cut. So that is our first pattern piece ready to go, ready to be pieced together. So I'll grab the next scrap and the next pattern piece. And again, you can draw in your arrow so that you know exactly what you're doing. Transfer the markings from the piece. Set that one aside, grab the next one. Making sure that you're working the same way. So this one, we cut out with the pattern facing up. sew the next scrap we're going to cut with the pattern facing up also. Working from the back, giving yourself enough room to add in your seam allowances. Minimum of 1/4 of an inch. I like to do 3/8 of an inch. Drawing in the line where we have cut the main pattern piece, and then cutting 3/8 of an inch away from that. And then this line being there already helps us line that back up if it shifts. And then cutting the rest of the pattern out just around the existing pattern lines. So we now have 2 of our pattern pieces. You can see how that's starting to come together there. And then we just need this last piece here. And then the same way, working from the back with the pattern piece oriented the same way as you did for the first 2 cuts. You're going to draw in your line at the edge of the pattern where we divided the piece. Add in your seam allowance, which you could draw into, and then cut, and then cut around the pattern the rest of the way with the original lines. And then you can see how the pieces will come together. See, that's why it's important to put the arrows on. The pieces will come together to make your color blocked panel once you sew them. When you're sewing, you want to sew together smaller pieces first. So I'm going to sew together these 2 pieces first, and then I will sew those onto the bigger piece. If I try to do it the other way, I'm going to end up with some tricky joins. So I will sew those 2 together first, and then I will sew those onto this piece, making sure that the pieces are all interfaced the way that they should be based on the material that they are. I'm going to line up these 2 pieces, and you want to make sure that your lines are matching up. So at the edge, you want the line that you drew on both sides to be lined up at the edge of the material, and then I'm just going to clip along this side. And you can see here that that is sticking out over the edge a little bit, and that's totally fine. That is because of the angle of the side, and you want that to be overlapped there. And where the 2 materials meet from this piece and this vinyl piece, that is where the line should be, and then you know that you've got your seam allowance placed correctly. So I'm going to sew along this line here, which will give me that 3/8 of an inch seam, and then I can open that out, and that will finish up that panel. That is now sewn together. You can choose to top stitch or not top stitch this seam here, and if you choose to top stitch, you can choose if you want to fold your seam allowance to one side or if you want to open it out. I like to open out this seam so that there is less bulk at the side. So I'm going to top stitch that open, and then I will be ready to attach the 3rd part of that panel. Since I'm going to be sewing down both sides of this join, I'm going to start my top stitching in this side seam here, sew along this edge, then I'm going to turn and turn again, come back down this side, and back stitch at this end. We can now attach the 3rd part of this front panel the same way as we attached the first 2, lining up the lines that we drew in with our seam allowance, and then clipping that in place. Then I'm going to sew along this line, back stitching well at both ends. That 3rd piece is sewn on, so now we can fold that open, and then you really get a good idea of what your panel piece is going to look like. And you can decide again if you want to top stitch this piece. I do recommend top stitching it so that it stays in place nicely. And whether you want to top stitch on just one panel or if you want to open out this seam and top stitch down both sides. And another benefit of having opened out this seam is that you can do that and there's not too much bulk there. So I'm going to open that out and I'm going to top stitch down both sides of that seam. I have that top stitching done. The next thing to do is to take an uncut pattern piece and place it on top of your piece together panel and make sure that it measures to size. And if it is too big in any of the dimensions, then you can just trim that up. And if you have these little bits still sticking off the edge, you can just cut that corner off. Double checking here. And then if there's any places that you just need to do a slight trim, but because we marked that seam allowance and we were careful to sew in the line, it's pretty close to the original pattern size. There's just a little bit of excess here that I'm just going to cut off. And then you would take both panel pieces and sew up your bag just like you normally would with a solid pattern piece. So I have both of those panels there and I would just sew that as normal. The next method that I want to show you is one where you have a piece of fabric that you really want to be able to position correctly on your pouch and showcase whether it's a panel or a scrap that you really like and you want to use as much of it as possible. And it does matter which part of it ends up on your project. So with this scrap, I don't just want to willy-nilly piece it together with another solid or another print. I want to have the piece with the pin cushion as much on the bag pattern as I can. So what I'm going to do is take my pattern piece. Ideally, you would have this transferred onto a transparent piece of plastic, like the template plastic I speak about in one of the Unlikely Sewing Tools videos, but I'm just going to use this one. So looking at my fabric, I'm going to place my pattern piece over the top, and then I'm just going to cut out as much as I can using the pattern piece. So make sure I'm happy with the placement. Knowing that it is not big enough for the whole thing, I'm just going to cut as much as I can out from this scrap of fabric. And now that that's cut, I know that I've got as much as I can get from my piece that I had left, and I need to create a straight edge to be able to do my color blocking. So I'm going to grab my ruler, and I'm just going to maximize the amount of this print that I'm keeping, cut a straight line, and then I'm going to fill that gap there with a scrap of another fabric. So you can see how much you need to cut to fill this little gap here. So I'm going to get another scrap to just fill that in. So take your piece that you've already cut and take a scrap that is bigger than the extra piece that you need to fill. And what we're going to do is attach that to the main part of our color blocked panel. So working from the back, you can see I'm definitely scrap busting here. I've also used scraps of interfacing for this. You're going to place it on that scrap and coming as close up to the edge as you can. We're not cutting at this point. We're just going to draw a line on the back. So now we know we've got the angle the same on both pieces that we're joining together. And now we can cut that. So flip it back over, and you can see that those are going to line up so that you can complete your panel. We need to sew this on, accounting for the seam allowance. So draw in your seam allowance on the back, 3/8, preferably, but 1/4 of an inch minimum if you don't have enough material to do 3/8. Or if you want to use even more of this print, you could do 1/4 of an inch so that you can show even more of that print. Because it's an angle, we're placing this so that it overlaps. This is a taller piece, so it's not going to be exact, but you want the line to at least go to the edge of your main piece. Mine goes over because my piece is taller, and that's fine. Clip that in place. And then I'm just going to sew along this line. That's sewn, so now we're going to fold open that seam allowance. And before we top stitch, we're just going to check that this panel is now big enough for our entire pattern piece. And I can see that it is. So I can top stitch this seam here, and then I can finish cutting out that pattern piece. So that is top stitch, and now we can finish cutting that out. So this method is kind of a hybrid of the first two ways that I showed you, because you really want this main print to be the focus of the panel, and the extra bit is just to fill in the gaps if you have perhaps a piece of fabric that is too small for the project that you want, or if you cut it incorrectly in the first place. The first method is if you just have some scraps that you want to piece together without too much concern for the specific pattern placement. And the second method that I showed you is when you specifically want your panel to be cut in a certain way to show 2 or more prints with that color blocking. So that panel is now complete and is ready to be sewn into the rest of the Betty pouch. I have one more color blocking method that I want to show you today, and that is when you are doing a curved color block. So this is a very oddly shaped scrap that I still want to be able to use in a bag, but it is cut out in this strange way that's going to make it very difficult to use on this pattern. So what I'm going to do is cut a curve into this so that I can use it for my pouch. The first thing I'm going to do is draw in a curve that can go around the odd shape of this fabric. You can freehand it, or if you have a curved ruler, you can use that. Something to consider when you are drawing in your curve is that you don't want to have your seam in the corners. So if I place this on here, the seam here for this will end up being just past the curve. So I'm going to just slide it up slightly. And then I'm going to cut the curve in my fabric scrap. And I'm going to cut this also to the correct width. So cutting out what I can from the pattern piece, the same as we did in the previous version. Now we are going to be cutting this pattern piece. So working from the back, place your curved fabric down onto your pattern piece, and we're just going to trace the curve onto that pattern piece. You can always use parchment paper if you don't want to draw directly onto your pattern or cut directly through your pattern template. Just tracing that in. And what we then need to do is add the seam allowance to this bottom panel piece. So we're going to add 1/2 of an inch minimum, preferably 3/4 of an inch, depending on how much of this you want to be folded into your seam allowance. I'm going to do 1/2 an inch today. So I'm going to take a ruler and I'm going to mark 1/2 an inch up from that curve in a few different spots. I like to draw this line freehand, and you can just use a ruler at the end to check that it is 1/2 an inch all the way along, just joining up those marks that we made around the shape of that curve. So I'm going to transfer the markings onto this pattern piece. Now this one is smaller right now because this has a seam allowance and this piece doesn't. So don't cut that smaller, but you can copy the marks that we just made. Let's transfer them over to the front. Just lay that down here. And just mark those points. And I'm also going to mark 1/4 inch up at the side. Take this pattern piece and making sure that you're positioning it the same way. So this is the right side up, so you want to be cutting this pattern piece with your coordinating solid or print facing the same way up. Grab your fabric and you're going to cut that out. Keep your scrap out of the way. Cutting along the line that we drew in. And cut around the rest of the pattern. And then take your piece and check that you have the 1/2 inch overlap. And you can lay your pattern pieces on top, or if you have an uncut one, to compare, just to make sure that it's going to be enough, and that looks good. Now we need to transfer the markings from this piece onto the back here. So you can see that those pieces are lined up, and now we need to join together the top and the bottom. We're going to join them first where we've marked those points. And then we're going to ease the top curve around the bottom curve, clipping as we go. And if we've got our marks pretty close, then this overlap here should be about 1/4 of an inch here and 1/4 of an inch here. That's pretty close. And we'll go back to the other mark, line that up also, and ease those two curves together. Continuing along to the other end. There's not as sharp of a curve at that end, so it should be pretty well lined up at that end. And if you've got any bunching, you can just ease it along. And when we go to sew this at the sewing machine, we're going to sew it with the side that has the concave curve, which is this direction. that piece of fabric that has the concave curve is going to be down on our feed dogs, and that will just ease that extra material from that curve. That will just ease that together. So we're going to sew along there at 1/4 of an inch. The first little part of the top curve piece here doesn't want to sit nice and flat once I come over to the machine. So I'm just going to put a staple within that seam allowance there. And I'm just folding this up at the back because my priority is to keep these two curves together. This part will smooth out once we fold that seam allowance down. And that will just hold that in place there so I can get started with sewing at 1/4 of an inch. So to make sure I can sew a nice curve here, I'm going to take my ruler and line it up 1/4 of an inch from the flat edge of my presser foot and move my needle over to meet that ruler so that I know if I keep the edge of the presser foot lined up with the edge of my fabric, I'll have a consistent 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm also going to be just tucking this top piece out of the way. You can see that it's folded up a bit because that curve is going the other way. So it'll flatten out once we finish sewing and then press it. But for right now, we're just going to kind of tuck that up out of the way so we can go around this curve. Back stitching and just following that curve all the way around. Then you can just pull that from underneath to keep the curve lined up. And then back stitch again. If you used a staple to keep that curve in place, you can just take that out now. And then we're just going to finger press that seam and then check that our piece is the correct size. So take an uncut pattern piece and just check that it is the right size. That's pretty close. After you've checked that the size is right, you can go ahead and top stitch. When you top stitch, you can choose to top stitch along the concave curve, along the convex curve, or to open out your seam allowance like so, and sew down both sides. I'm going to sew down both sides of the curve on mine. For the bottom part here, when I fold it down, it does curl a little bit. It does get a little bit of a wave in there. So I'm just going to put a couple of little tiny snips just within that seam allowance to help that to sit a little bit more flat, and then I can top stitch it. You can also, if you wish, put a little bit of double-sided tape down there, and that will help keep that in place. Making sure if your machine struggles with a double-sided tape that you keep it out of where your top stitching will be done. So you'd want to put it right up against the edge here because we only took 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so you want to make sure you're not catching it. So you want to be very careful with your placement. If you're having trouble with the top curve sitting nicely, you can put some snips around the curve there too. Mine is sitting okay, so I'm just going to do that for the bottom piece, but I am going to demonstrate this double-sided tape just right at the very, very edge. Just press that down. Smooth that out. If you're using a material that you can iron on, you may want to press that just to make sure that your curve is sitting nice and flat. And then we're going to top stitch on both sides of that curved line. Using a longer stitch length, starting in the side seam and back stitching there. And then going along the edge of that curved line using the inside of my presser foot right here as a guide, keeping an eye on this part of the presser foot, not the needle, and just watching as this join feeds past that part of the presser foot. I will have a nice consistent stitch line, and when I get to the curve, just taking it nice and slowly, and if I need to, pivoting my fabric by just gently raising the presser foot with the needle down to go around the curve. This is just a gradual curve. so it's not as tricky as some sharper curves that you see on flaps and similar items. And then we can go and trim that down to the final size. This is just skewed just a tiny bit, but it's pretty close enough. Any difference would just be within the seam allowance. So I'm going to trim that to size. When you are matching up your curves, you can start at the center point, mark the center, and then work out from the center and match up your other markings, and that will also help you to have a more exact match between your two curves. And then you would just put any stabilizer on that you wanted to use and continue with sewing your Betty pouch. So those are just a few different techniques to give you a starting off point for your color blocking on all of your different bag patterns. And in part 2, we will look at specific color blocking variations for the Logi pouch. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.